so much. Welcome everyone to Gems from the Wisdom Traditions, brought to you by Still and Moving Center every Saturday when we have the opportunity to take up a topic of conversation that comes from our Still and Moving Center Almanac, for which this year is focusing on citizens of the future. And as we look into the future, it's not probably with complete bright optimism for things to come. I think all of us have a reality factor that will probably be pertinent to consider when we're thinking about this week's theme of the cycle of the phoenix, which is what we know, a mythical bird who rises from the ashes of destruction. I feel fortunate to be able to introduce our speaker today. This is Sarah Hodges. Sarah Hodges, I think of very much as a citizen of the future, a citizen of the world. She has traveled and studied in many places around the world and knows a number of the world's languages. And she has, in the past, taken up different ones of our topics and this idea of lifelong learning. And so taking a topic that she's never really studied before and bravely saying, yes, I'd be delighted to study that on behalf of all the rest of you, which she did most recently, I think, for our consideration of George William Russell, an Irish mystic, poet, and labor union leader. This week we're getting maybe a little bit closer to at least half of her heritage home, since she's half Persian, and so this idea of the phoenix, in the origin, I think, of the word phoenix is from Greece, and there is a Persian version even of the phoenix that I don't know, we may be considering. At any rate, we're so thrilled to have you, Sarah. Thank you for being here, and we'll turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you, Renee, and so nice to see you all. And I will, as Renee said, recently she asked me to open up this topic, so I will bring the topic into our space and try to carry it into this space, and then we can all come around and share about it. So one thing to consider, I was thinking, well, we're talking about myth, and so I wanted everyone to consider for a second, what role does myth play in your life? And even if that isn't a traditional mythology, I think as humans, we have all been exposed to myth, importantly so maybe. And as we consider the myth and the symbol of the phoenix, you can also think, is it possible? Is there any life, any nature that exists without this process of creation and destruction? And how does this symbol of the phoenix that maybe most of us have been exposed to in some small way, large way, how does that inform our way to navigate this natural process? So looking at the history of the phoenix, it comes up across from ancient Egypt, in classical Greek mythology. In China, there's a mythology related. In India, there's also a parallel mythology, in Iran also. So this idea of a winged creature, a flying creature that has an element of immortality, that faces destruction and withstands and rises up into something even greater. This is carried throughout a story of humanity, and probably within each of us. So a little bit on its story. In the Egyptian story of the phoenix, it was a large, brilliant bird, had a beautiful song, has a beautiful song in this story. As it approaches its end, it makes a nest of branches with aromatic branches, spices, and then it sets the nest on fire, and it's consumed in these flames. And from the fire, it springs up a new phoenix, so not the same one. And then it carries the ashes. In one of the tellings of this story, it carries the ashes to the city of the sun in Egypt. And it deposits these on the altar of a temple. And thinking about that, I thought, well, as we can relate this story of the phoenix to our lives, that's something to consider too. Can we bring our ashes to an altar to really honor and have this full story? So we have one of our great holders and teachers of mythology of modern time, Joseph Campbell, who talks a lot about how ancient myth is meant to harmonize our mind and our body. Our minds can trail off and go into all kinds of places, and having stories as humanity can help give us a context, a space to kind of contain the wild wanderings of the mind sometimes in a way that can help us harmonize with these different life stages. So I know we have, I think Elizabeth is here, and she's also a great scholar of some mythological traditions. And I really want to open things up to you all and hear your perspective. What is your experience in hearing about the story of the phoenix and with mythology in your life?
Well, thank you, Sarah, for having looked into the Phoenix story. I guess I've always preferred some of the other myths because of the concept of everything burning to ashes before the new arises. And so I gravitate to stories like the butterfly and the chrysalis, where the new is being formed as the old dissolves, rather than after it, is gone. And where the caterpillar actually kind of seems to fight for its life as long as possible, which we're seeing a lot of in the world today, the predatory, all-consuming caterpillar not wanting to let go. I have a favorite cartoon that shows two caterpillars standing on a leaf looking up at a butterfly, and the one says to the other, "You'll never get me up in one of those." Which is the caterpillar saying no to the new world, to what we're talking about with unity and harmony, while it still wants to make profits from warfare and all those things that we wish we could get rid of. I also, in the world of mythology, have questioned the hero's journey myth, which Campbell talked about as the most pervasive one across cultures, because it's always bothered me that Odysseus or Ulysses goes through so much to mature, to learn, and then when he gets home, all he does is like give his sword to his son to help bump off the suitors that have been trying to get his wife while he was gone. And it doesn't talk about how does he rule Ithaca now, as the mature person who's learned all this. So it seems to me that myth too is kind of lacking, because it trails off without, at least to me, giving the desired next stage of, what is this new world? What is this phoenix? The second phoenix. I do like the idea that you pointed out, Sarah, of our carrying our ashes, which could be interpreted very much as our shadow, to give up on the altar of whatever it is that we don't want anymore, to recycle our shadow side, our ashes, which of course all of us have. So those are a few comments. Let's get to somebody else.
Well, you bring up an interesting point about how, one, we have this idea of the game of telephone that we're all familiar with, that over time this story gets slightly altered and slightly altered. And we do have historians and people really working hard to preserve ancient stories. And then at the same time, I think there's an important piece of evolving these stories to really fit our current life. And I think for anything to really survive, as we see in nature, it needs to transform, it needs to evolve. And same with these stories, I believe, as important as it is to maintain the records of where these stories come from, we do need a new telling of it, a evolved telling of it, as we as humans are evolving in our thought and in our consciousness, hopefully. So I think I really appreciate that point that you're making, that we really can evolve and can talk about these stories and find current understandings of it in our lives. And I took it as, I'm not sure exactly which tradition, if they're exacting on at what point the ashes are there and at what point the phoenix is birthed and a new phoenix rises, but I think maybe we can lose the old self or the old something of an old that turns to ashes. That's right from that. Maybe it doesn't completely go away, but something from that is birth. So.
Do you think that in a way, even though it's a new phoenix that arises, that phoenix arises from a particular set of ashes? It's not from any old set of ashes anywhere, but it arises from this particular set, so that there perhaps is some sense of continuity and growth. There, that's my question.
Actually, Renée, that's a good point. See what that there are these particular things that need to evolve. And oh, what was it? Something just crossed my mind when you said that. Hold till later. Let somebody else talk, and I'll try to remember what it was.
Thinking from yogic terms, the fire or the tapas is the means of transformation. And like Renée said, the ashes are, what remains. The rest of the stuff is burnt up, but the real gems remain in the ashes. Kind of similar to the Hawaiian idea of the bones, carrying the mana, that wisdom is carried in the ashes. My thoughts. Wonder too about the timing of these events, or the timing that these myths evolved in terms of humans' development, that these stories may have been at a time when fire was kind of held as somewhat the almighty, early on, when fire was when we discovered our use of fire, and really that was a transformational technology in itself. So I was thinking these might be older mythologies than perhaps the butterfly and the understanding of metamorphosis.
I do remember now what it was. I used to teach workshops on worldviews to see how people's individual worldviews evolve. And one of the things I discovered in leading those workshops was that people rarely change their garden of beliefs story, their worldview, until something dramatic and difficult and devastating happens in their lives. It always comes after either a divorce or their house burning down or a major illness or something like that. So there's a good example of something going to ashes that helps you create a new story. So there's a place where that Phoenix story would be really valid.
They carry with them something of their past while they're moving into their future at this dramatic juncture, where some aspect of their past probably lies in some form of destruction. And yet there's other aspects of their past that they are carrying forward, so that there is a continuity of identity, so to speak. Even though, I mean, I suppose many of us have had the experience of kind of feeling like this is a new me. Yes, I still remember everything that happened before now, and it's not disjointed from the way I live my life or how I identified myself or whatever from the past. And yet, this is a new me that I'm bringing forward now. So there's both the new and the continuity combined somehow.
Well, I didn't have a prepared question, and I'm sorry, Sarah, I came in late. But I have some things going in my head. I was wondering if you could say something about the idea of the phoenix, not just from the point of view of the individual process, maybe that, but more of a collective process, like a whole group or a society and so forth, going through some kind of like resurrection. You know, you have a lot of these words like regeneration, resurrection, revolution. They say that, you know, the night is always darkest before the dawn. So you get really discouraged sometimes, but if you could see the fire behind the smoke, then there's a possibility for like real change. If you knew the potential was there for collective uplift, then you might be able to tap into that. I remember reading a book, an essay in the Atlantic about this idea of plastic moments, that in history there's these times in history where if we take advantage of them, we can do tremendous positive change, but they can also go by if we don't, like, carpe diem, seize the opportunities. So I'm just wondering if you had any thoughts on the idea of the phoenix and collective elevation or uplift or whatever.
Yeah, I was just about to say something stemming from what Elizabeth had said about this need for the destruction before we go into our next stage, and kind of thinking about how wondering that is society, and we watch over and over again these different forms of society is creating its own destruction, and it seems like, wow, we're really destructive creatures on this planet. Yeah. But maybe it made me wonder, maybe we need to be, because maybe it's a matter of not having the wisdom to go about it in a different way, but we know somehow we need to destroy this thing that isn't functioning well. And is there a bypass to not destroy before creation? I'm not sure. Maybe this destruction is us just following nature, just like a rainforest or a forest will put itself into flames to regenerate. And maybe we're resisting the human tendency for destruction. Maybe it doesn't have to be so extreme, but that was one thought that was coming, that we're actually following this natural course of destruction and then creation. We're attached to a lot of things and it can be very unsettling. But it is in a way following nature, not to promote destruction, but there's a lot of hope also on the other side of that, that there's so much new that is created that will be created.
That's a really, I think the forest is a really good example from nature about the necessity for the destruction to get at the kernel of what, yeah. It's all that harshness that needs to be busted apart before you can get to the germ that is the seed of new growth. And I think in last week's talk, Joe Miller was talking about the theosophical point of view, that humankind and all of the crazy things that we might think of as destructive are a part of the natural process, that humanity and all the things that we, from our limited scope of view, might think, you know, we're a destructive virus on the planet. But I believe that his point was that theosophy argues that no, that is a part of the evolutionary process for consciousness. I may be totally off base there.
I think that's what he was saying, yeah.
And this is called the cycle of the phoenix, right? This topic is the cycle of the phoenix. So in order for us to even have room for new things to come into the universe, something has to go.
Oh, Renee, that reminds me of my favorite Greek philosopher is Anaximander. And we have only one line left of all his work. And that one line is, everything that forms in nature incurs a debt which it must repay by dissolving so that other things may form. Now that's a one-sentence description of a circular economy, of a recycling nature. Everything that forms in nature incurs a debt, which it must repay by dissolving so that other things may form. If that isn't a phoenix story, also.
It's so well worded, the way that translation goes. I wonder if you could drop that into our chat for us.
Okay, I can do that. It's my own translation from the ancient Greek.
Well, very well done, I would say.
He was a kind of back then attorney. So he had this legalistic mindset. Okay, I'll put it in the chat.
Yeah. Sarah, don't I recall, maybe it was from the Wikipedia conversation on the phoenix, that the phoenix is always female and it is always beneficent in every tradition. Do I remember that correctly?
I'm not sure if every tradition is female. So we'd have to look that up again, but always beneficent, yeah.
Always beneficent is consistent. And do you remember any of the details of the other traditions, like the Persian one or the Chinese one? I don't.
I'll read a little excerpt here. As the Chinese related the appearance of the phoenix to abundance, the tree bears fruit under direct rays of the sun. Abundance will form, inform will perish as light gives way to darkness. So it was very much about abundance in the Chinese tradition.
And did you compare it to a tree? Did I hear you say tree?
Right, the tree of the world bears fruit under direct rays of the sun. So we'll have to look a little deeper into that.
Yeah. Huh, interesting.
That was another common relation with the phoenix to the sun in most traditions. And then in the Persian tradition, they have a similar bird called the simor. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing it right. All the way from the Ottoman Empire, they have this. And this bird was symbolized also with the heart and the heart of a lever. And also representing reason and consciousness. So a slightly different variation of the female.
I wonder whether we have a shared experience of having gone through a period of loss of some sort, and as a result, having an enhanced level of consciousness, that we understand things at a more elevated, deeper level, that we just have a different kind of awareness as a result of that loss, of that, maybe it was a destruction of something that we had in our lives before.
I don't know if I have necessarily a lost story, but I do find that things are more rewarding, or you feel more accomplished if it did involve a little bit of a struggle or some sort of monument in your life that you had to achieve. I think the gratitude aspect grows tenfold if you've not had the easy go of it. And I think a lot of people utilize those little obstacles or, destructions in their path to kind of perpetuate them to keep going further. I know that, I'm one of these people that I've definitely had some learning experiences over my life, and I'd rather make a huge mistake and make that stick than just kind of, doing things half energy or half completed. So I think that oftentimes, like as Sarah was mentioning, those ashes get carried with you. Those memories or those sticking points can really be something to, just once you've obtained it, you don't just stop there. You keep climbing and keep going. So I really appreciate now that visual of the cycle, because it may happen multiple times, or there may be one, really influential moment in your life that this is part of. But for most, that kind of is a momentum to continue going and just strive for greater things.
Do you have a specific example in mind that you wouldn't feel like it was too personal to share?
So I think many of the people in this group know I grew up as a dancer. I competed a lot. And in the competition world, I did dance just for the love of it. But when it got to that point about competing and seeing all these other amazing schools that were out there, it really kind of grounded yourself a little bit. And you realize that, wow, there are many talented people, and it's not going to be just an easy win. Not that winning was everything, but it always was, of course, a nice accolade to put that you have mastered this certain genre of dance or whatever. But yeah, I think that, or even just I know that when I was going from being on the move constantly, changing countries every month, then the pandemic hit and we were just, at a standstill. Whenever I think, oh my gosh, life is overwhelming, or, this is not exactly the path that we wanted, I just am reminded back to those times that, yeah, the pandemic and everything else was a very big hit for a lot of people, but look at what has come from that. I would not be able to participate with GEMS had it not been for introducing Zoom and everything else like that. And I just think that fortunately, the people that I surround myself with are those that kind of take a not so positive experience and kind of spin it, because you can either cry and feel defeated, or you can just keep on going and just continue to give everything, because we've seen time and time again that there are times in life when things are not always going to go the way that you've planned or would like them to. But I think that I've always been a firm believer of hope and just, manifesting the positivity. So.
Is the phoenix a symbol of hope in and of itself?
I think it definitely can be related in that way. That it's not like it's transforming through water or through air. It's transforming through fire. And this is total heat and fury and whatever it may be. And yet even in that, and even in disintegrating, something comes up and comes into the air and is able to travel and to go on even in a renewed state. So that sounds like a story of hope. Mary?
Yes.
Well, it's not along the lines of, I think what we've been talking about, but it is, because I was thinking of, like you were saying about changes and milestone moments. That's not the word I want. But when we lose something, I think we treasure our memories. So that to me is very important, that we choose to remember the good times. And that's hope. And yes, Kevin, hope. Amen.
Amen.
I wonder what the relationship is of the story to the idea of reincarnation and man's general, fear of death. Well, what happens to our, when our parents have passed away? What will happen to us? And that eternal question about life after death.
Good point, David. I do have a personal story. I've realized after we talked some more. I moved to Greece in the late 70s. I, at the time, had co-owned a duplex house with a friend, and I sold my share of it to him. And I took a few boxes of, really essential stuff for living with me to Greece. And my very most prized possessions all went stashed in the basement of the house. And that included things like all of the movie footage and slides and mementos from a trip to China in 1973 that were, irreplaceable kind of documentation of that time. And all of my best clothes and, all of the paintings, you name it, my most prized possessions. And it turned out that my friend sent them all to Goodwill when he sold the house, claiming he couldn't find me, which really wasn't true. But that was a huge loss to me. It left me rootless. So, with just those few bits of stuff, few books and clothes I had taken with me to Greece. But I used that for many years afterwards to always reduce all of my material possessions to what would fit into 1 cubic meter of space. I'm a really good packer. I got a rocking chair and a lamp and all kinds of things into that kind of space. But I made myself do kind of the same thing over and over. And it was like shedding thing glut, and made me lighter and enabled me to go live in wild places, from Peru to Spain to other parts of the world, and to learn more about the world. Being a planet person, that was important. So that was probably the biggest material loss in my life, and it did lead to something very positive. So
What a fascinating story, Elizabeth. It kind of helped ensure you against suffering such a huge loss ever again, didn't it?
yes, and it's why I live in one room, a wonderful room with a glass wall. Right? At this point, to avoid, it's amazing how you accumulate in this consumer culture. You can't avoid accumulating even when you live in one room.
Kept it up all these years. It's really fascinating.
That is similar to the idea that a task will expand. The time it takes to complete a task will expand to the amount of time that you've given it. So they say, if you want to get something done, give it to a person who's already busy. Because there is this notion of momentum, and the bigger closet you have, the more things you're going to store away. So I think there's some basic principle of physics that are at play in this idea.
Fill the time allotted, and the stuff will fill the space allotted.
Yeah.
That sounds like a really painful lesson to learn, however. Like one of those searing kind of pains when you found out that everything really precious to you in the material world had disappeared.
Yeah, I'm sorry that Carol Ann is not with us today because she has told some poignant stories about her journey. And similarly, the stories of people who have had, well, both, there's a similarity between abduction stories, near-death or return from death stories, and psychedelic journeys, all saying that they've gone to that, to the other side. And when they come back, there is this deeper sense about meaning in life and the preciousness of life. And this whole transformation from a life of fear to a life of love, I think is one of the common themes that come back from those experiences.
This process of letting go, the destruction, whatever it is, and then regenerating, we can get very comfortable in the context of as things are and want things to stay as they are. So that nimbleness is really, really helpful to transform that part of the psyche that wants to hold on and keep the status quo or keep the normal ways of defining life, to the part that can step beyond the fear and really embrace, really accept kind of that flow, allowing the flow.
Are you finding symbolism in the phoenix?
And the cycle of the phoenix.
Cycle.
Both, yes, It is interesting that in Indian tradition of the Trimurti, or the symbol of the divine under three aspects, there's creation, preservation, and destruction for the sake of recreation. And the deity associated with that destruction for the sake of recreation is Shiva. And his consort, by the way, is known in different aspects, one of which is Kali, another of which is Durga, and both of those are very destructive goddesses, and they tend to dance in the burning ground. They dance in the place of cremation. And a follower of a Shiva tradition is often going to put ashes across the forehead as a symbol of being a follower of that particular tradition. So it is interesting how that same theme of fire and ashes come up for the sake of regeneration. It's not, like you say, Sarah, it's not a destruction by water. It's not a destruction in the earth, not by air, it's fire.
It is interesting that our culture, the dominant world culture, is so very resistant to having a circular economy in which you recycle. And it's such a measure of the juvenile aspects of growth capitalism, endless growth, endless taking without giving back. And we're talking, you know, I'm now seeing this whole Phoenix story in that light, that it is symbolic of the necessity of things dissolving so that other things can form, the necessity of building economies that are circular the way nature's economy is. There is no waste in nature. It's a human invention, just as is monoculture and the concept of non-life. These are things Western science has brought us that aren't suiting us very well. So You know, I'm seeing the Phoenix story now in terms of our resistance to a recycling economy.
Do you think that our fear of losing things is that we don't have a sense of confidence that something else will arise in its place? It's the difference, I think, between a scarcity mindset and an abundance mindset. And when we think of things cyclically, whether it's a cyclic economy or the cycles of nature, for example, I wonder if it could help us to gain more of the abundance mindset, less of the fear of scarcity, just knowing that things always cycle through, and that when something is lost, something always rises up to fill its place. That, just for example, that energy cannot be lost in the universe. It can only be transformed. And somehow, maybe when we have those kind of angsty feelings in ourselves of worry and about loss, and I know I've had them. I've had them about money. I once had a grand mal seizure because I was afraid we were going to go bankrupt. This is a true story. And it was all about loss of stuff. And or lifestyle or whatever, you know, that's associated with that. And if we really can use the human mind, I mean, because we have this emotional nature that can get all stirred up, the mental nature can too, but if we can harness the mind and use it to think of the logic of things and how there is always replenishment after loss, think of the cyclic nature of things. If this cycle of the phoenix can't be a hopeful story for us, it's always beneficent.
I think it's a great reminder of that, because maybe even now in the structure of modern society, we are farther from nature. So it's possible, being closer to nature, we would have these understandings in us deeper, but now we're a bit more removed and have forgotten that it's not just about material gain. And even though we do know that on some level, what we're most exposed to is a lot of the opposite of about, you want to keep this and have this and maintain this, and loss is bad. And this is just the narrative that we're so often exposed to it. Whereas nature is giving us a different narrative. But I think we're not as close to nature at this point. Maybe necessarily so for our own human cycle, but maybe that's important.
Thank you.
You know, all indigenous cultures held nature to be sacred and remained close to it, and felt humble that nature was the elder brothers, the mothers, the fathers, you know, things like that. And in our culture, we separated our rational mind and our material selves from our own spirituality. It was like put aside as something, you know, extra that maybe you did on Sundays or whatever, so that we didn't play the whole keyboard, as I like to say, of matter, energy, spirit. And so we lost such a big part of ourselves in the materialist worldview that we didn't even recognize how incredibly cooperative we are, you know, in our big cities, cooperating all day long, because we were told this story of our competition as the whole world was sliding into no thingness, that entropy, everything going to hell in a handbasket. So get what you can while you can. It's that whole philosophy, that whole cultural story that separated ourselves from such a big part of ourselves and from nature, that gets us into the fear mode. Because when you have this, it's like the astronauts saying, suddenly, Ed Mitchell said, suddenly I felt held in the arms of the universe, and I knew I was there forever. I could not be lost. That's what's missing for us. That's where the fear comes from.
That is a very common perspective, right, Elizabeth? When anybody is able to get far enough away from Earth and be able to look at this beautiful marble spinning through space, from what I understand, they universally have this just grand sense of awe and appreciation. I'd never heard that particular quote. That's very beautiful.
But it's not only that, but it's that feeling of security in the universe, that here you are in a little tin can, out in black space. And instead of fear, they had this sense of being enfolded, by the universe, being whatever happens, I am still part of creation, whatever. And of course, a belief in reincarnation is really useful. You get to do it over from another perspective if you don't get this one right, so what's to worry? You don't even have to be so very self-critical all the time. I'm not doing it right. I'm too little. I'm not doing enough. I'm, all of that kind of fear too. Hey, you don't have to do everything in one life.
This might be directed back towards Elizabeth, but I started thinking when you were mentioning our loss of the reverence for nature as what we knew as a manifest destiny, that I guess it was 19th century when that idea, but it was the Americans' belief that it was our divine destiny to take over the rest of the continent and spread our values and beliefs. And in that was in a large part when we lost. And in fact, that's when we displaced the Native American population. And I'm just wondering what maybe where did that idea come from? What sort of, go ahead, please take it away.
There was that papal bull, the doctrine of discovery. If you encountered other humans and they weren't Christians, they didn't count, and whatever land they were on was yours. The Pope just rescinded that, and yet many of the practices coming from that incredibly arrogant feeling of superiority and dominion, domination is still there in many indigenous practices, as they are pointing out now, that you need more than just to rescind that old idea of conquest in new territories, and still we have so much cleanup to do here. But the Haudenosaunee Indians, for example, had the only living democracy I know of that was a real democracy, and little bits of it got into our Constitution, actually one big piece, the separation of powers. But these so-called Indians, the Native American, they had no fear of nature. It was abundant and it would support them. And even if they had to move somewhere or store things against a drought year or whatever, the kind of fear that comes when you're a dominator, you always have to hang on to your power, and you have to be afraid of not having enough physical stuff, not having food. And the Indians were constantly like feeding these people, but you know, it took time for them to settle and grow their own gardens. Anyway, it's that fear in our culture is really, really, I don't know. I hope it motivates us in a healthy phoenix kind of way. And there's lots of reason to be afraid nowadays when you see climate change and you see the large structures crumbling and you know, all of these things. It's easy to get into fear mode and not to trust nature, spirit, and each other, because it's all about community and building self-sufficient community. That's what takes the fear away, is if you know that, you know, I love the Sarvodaya movement in Sri Lanka, where it's based entirely on two principles that are taught to little children to meditate on: inner peace and generosity. Imagine a world where everyone is peaceful and is focused on what they have to give. No one would be in want. It's so simple when you find these really simple ways of living together that have been so lost, that we need to build this beautiful new phoenix. However difficult, however there may be great reductions in the human population, we still will get through this bottleneck, and we have this opportunity for humanity to get it right as a whole, rather than the old indigenous cultures that were trying desperately to teach it to us.
This idea of fear, I think, sometimes gets a little bit of a bad rap, like because a certain amount of fear, you might call it reverence, because there's nothing quite like a tornado to make you appreciate the power of nature, to have your whole village to be wiped out. So I think a reverence might be a better understanding of that. Yeah, we better pay attention to nature, because really, she has the last say in what goes down. And for us personally, like fear is, a certain amount of fear is necessary for our survival. That we don't step in front of a bus because, you know, we understand the law of cause and effect.
That's a great distinction. And realizing that maybe we don't have enough words to describe, there are different fears. There's the grasping fear, which this cycle of letting go and of creation is very hopeful and dismantling. And then there's reverence and the necessary fears.
Can you say a little more about that, Sarah?
Yeah, just going off of what David and Elizabeth were just sharing about, that fear is necessary, but this word that we have for fear is not sufficient, because there's grasping fear that is probably just a manifestation of the psyche in imbalance, and that isn't quite harmonizing with what exists and with nature. And so the cycle that we have, that we're speaking on, of phoenix, of creation, of transformation, of eternal rising up and letting go, it's maybe a nice masseuse for our grasping fears. But nimble and keep refreshing.
That notion of the fear of God, I always had difficulty with in my Christian upbringing. Like, why would I fear God? Because, you know, it's the giver of life. But maybe this is that kind of fear. It's that reverence for the divine.
I wonder even if in translation we didn't have the correct word, since we're only using fear really as the word, that there's something much deeper, there's something much stronger that combines reverence, combines really a bowing to something that has great force, great power.
I hear Renee tapping away, making notes for satsang tomorrow.
Yes, indeed. And certainly fire is one of those things that does have great power. I mean, fire can catch our attention, I think, in a way none of the other three elements that we've been talking about often do. It's so dramatic and it can be so quick. And if something can survive even that, what a symbol of renewal it is. Right. Well, I'm going to let one of you volunteer in a moment to give a vote of thanks to Sarah for her help in starting us off in this fascinating conversation today. I'll let you know that next week we are going to be taking up the idea of mental posture from the standpoint of someone who has been teaching yoga and studying yogic philosophy to a certain degree. She's a young yoga teacher, Anna Morales, and she's going to be looking in part from at it in part from the teachings of the great, I would say, recorder of the yogic tradition, and that's Patanjali. So I think it we'll also have a very interesting conversation about this mental posture, and it's very appropriate to Still and Moving Center to be thinking about mental posture as well as physical postures, and what do the physical postures maybe point to more importantly on the mental and spiritual realms. So I would ask if anybody would like to give Sarah a vote of thanks on behalf of all of us for her
I will
conversations.
dive right. Yeah, I'll dive right in there because Sarah, I just love having you back in the circle because you add so much. You emanate a sense of like a deep understanding about the balance of nature and of life, and yeah, it's just great that you got this topic, and I appreciate also that you kept it kind of short and allowed for more conversation from the group. I know some of our presenters tend to get a little lengthy, and while they have a lot to say, it was nice for us to be able to speak our truths as well. So I greatly appreciate and hope to see more of you. I've missed having you in the circle and enjoy your perspectives very much. So thank you.
Thanks, David. Yeah, I've missed being here. This is a great welcoming back, and I'll plan on being around for more of these. Thank you all.
Thank you all so much. We really appreciate it. If anybody would like to stay on any longer, we'll keep the floor open, so to speak, just a bit longer. And meanwhile, we are past the top of the hour. Sarah, thank you so much for joining us. I just really love the lifelong learning spirit that you bring. It's so fearlessly.
Thank you.
Yes.
I may have told you this story once before about a trip I had out in Joshua Tree, literally a trip. It was a psychedelic trip. And we had come back from a long hike, a group of 12 of us. We had come back from a long hike, and a flash flood had taken our camp away. And it was scattered for quite a distance across the desert, and we had to reclaim our belongings while we're, still on psychedelics. And I'd found the tent and all of its contents inside, but it was all collapsed. And I'm trying to pull it back across the desert floor. And inside, the ice chest is kind of tumbling and stuff is spilling out. And I could not figure out how to make anything work. And I realized that it was bigger than I could handle. And I literally lost my mind. And I started, basically all I could say was, I've lost my mind. I found the group and I could not make sense of anything. Nothing was making sense. And my partner and others realized that I really needed some help. And they got the tent set up. They took me inside and just held me. And once I felt safe, I basically let go and I disappeared. Basically, consciousness went to nothingness. And at some point, I experienced the only thing that was the only thought was gray. And then the next thought was gray is a word. Words are thoughts. I'm having thoughts. There's a me. And I basically reconstructed reality from the 0 point. But I came away from it with a much greater understanding about the nature of mind and the nature of reality, that we construct reality from nothing. We are meaning makers. And it's, I think it's been a very empowering place to operate from. And a little, my friend Audie, who was had his home, it was not Topanga Canyon, but one of those canyon fires where they had literally like 15 minutes to grab their photographs and leave home. And his entire video editing studio and all of his possessions, other than what he was able to grab in moments, was taken from him. And from that, he had a couple of years of like, and now he lives what he says is his best life. All of that history was taken from him, and it took him a couple of years to realize that being released from his history gave him his new life. Literally the fires of transformation for him.
I just wanted to comment that I think very much the phoenix is representative of the idea of reincarnation. And the fact that it's always beneficent, the fact that it arises out of ashes. So there is something out of which it does arise, even though it's turned to ash. There is something from which it arises. It indicates to me a certain continuity, as if, you know, the phoenix incorporates, because like Sarah was saying, in the Egyptian myth, the phoenix carries the ashes to the temple, right? It's like the phoenix incorporates within itself, like you were saying, in the Hawaiian tradition, the bones carry the mana. It sounds as if within the story of the phoenix, something of that mana, that energy, that preciousness of life, and something of the essence of what came before is held within the ashes, that somehow then become the phoenix. And it happens all over again, and then there's new ash and new phoenix. So I think it's probably very deliberately symbolic of reincarnation and the continuity principle of it.
Yeah.
So I'm glad you made that point.
Yeah.